Welcome to The Deep Dive. We're all about cutting through the noise, getting you those key insights, those aha moments fast so you feel genuinely informed. Today, we're diving deep into something really fundamental, maybe even overlooked sometimes. It's how national censuses, across the globe actually track access to drinking water and sanitation. And this isn't just about crunching numbers, it's about getting to the heart of a huge global issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And for this deep dive, we're leaning heavily on a really key research article. It's called A Global Perspective on Drinking Water and Sanitation Classification and Evaluation of Census Content. It's by you and colleagues, published back in PLS 1 in 2016. A critical piece, really.
Definitely. So our mission today, for you listening, is to unpack how the census data we do have lines up with these, ambitious new international goals for water and sanitation. And maybe more crucially, pinpoint where the big gaps are, the missing pieces in the puzzle. Let's get into it. Okay, so to really grasp these data challenges, we need to kind of step back first. We need to look at the big shift and how the world monitors progress on these critical development goals. We all remember the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs. They ran out in 2015. And that paved the way for the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which set targets all the way out to 2030. But it wasn't just swapping acronyms, right? It fundamentally changed the kind of data needed.
Exactly. And a really fascinating part of this is SDG Goal 6. That's the one entirely focused on water, sanitation, and hygiene garbage, as it's known. And the World Health Organization, WHO, and UNICEF, they have this joint monitoring program, the JMP. They've been absolutely central in shaping these new, more demanding targets, pushing for a much more nuanced understanding.
That's such a key point, because moving from MDGs to SDGs brought completely new demands, like you said, on the data sources. Before, MDG monitoring was pretty basic. It was mostly just improved sources versus unimproved ones, simple categories.
Yeah.
But the post-2015 proposals, the SDG framework, it's way more granular, and there's a good reason for that. They now bring in crucial things like actual water quality, which wasn't really there before, and reducing inequalities between different groups, looking at different levels of service like basic access versus safely managed access, even access outside the home, think schools, health clinics.
Yeah, and sustainability, hygiene.
Exactly. It's a whole evolution really reflecting this deeper idea of water and sanitation as a fundamental human right.
So you might be wondering, why focus so much on national censuses for this? For what age access specifically? Well, what's really striking is their coverage. They aim for near-complete population counts, and that gives them a unique edge over national surveys, which usually sample a smaller percentage. It lets the data be spatially disaggregated, fancy term, but basically
That means you can zoom right in, like neighborhood level.
pretty much break it down into really small areas. And that's crucial because it lets us quantify access even for, tiny minority populations or really isolated communities.
Yeah.
Groups that might just get missed or averaged out in standard surveys.
Absolutely. And that ability to zoom in connects directly to a really interesting policy shift.
Yeah.
As global access to improve water and sanitation has gone up, which is good news,
Sure.
the people still left behind, the unserved populations, they tend to be smaller groups, but often more concentrated geographically or socially. So monitoring those inequalities in access among these minority groups, that's actually part of SDG Target 4, becomes way more important. And censuses are just a better tool for that job. Surveys would need huge, expensive oversampling to get a clear picture of those smaller groups.
But there's always a but, isn't there? Despite these clear advantages, censuses have their own unique challenges when it comes to WASH. Unlike, say, the demographic and health surveys, the DHS, which have pretty standardized questions on water and sanitation.
Right. Those are quite consistent.
Census questions are often much less standardized from one country to another. The UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNSD, they recommend assessing housing, but they don't actually mandate specific core WAFIsh questions.
So it's optional, basically.
Effectively, yeah. And that leads to all sorts of inconsistent terminology across countries, which, you can imagine, seriously undermines how useful that data is for comparing apples to apples globally.
So you end up with these huge efforts trying to harmonize everything after the fact, like the IPMS International Project or the JMP itself. They're trying to standardize this incredibly diverse census data. But it sounds like a massive headache. You've got cultural differences affecting how terms are understood.
Definitely. What piped water means can vary.
Right. And then wildly uneven data quality between countries or even within them. And just the sheer volume of variables.
It's a monumental task. The JMP even has to apply these things called adjustment corrections. They try to make sense of ambiguous terms, like if a census just says, well, They try to figure out if it's likely an improved protected source or just an open, unimproved hole in the ground.
Wow, okay. So it requires a lot of interpretation.
Exactly. And connecting this back, the study we're focusing on today, the U et al. Paper, it took a really big, unprecedented step. They assessed 2047 different censuses.
247.
Yeah, from 83 low and lower middle income countries. And these were specifically chosen because they were countries identified as not having met the old 2015 MDG targets for water and sanitation. And what's really significant is that this study was the very first to systematically analyze the actual content related to water and sanitation in national censuses on this kind of global scale.
Okay, so how did they actually do that? How do you systematically compare 2047 different questionnaires?
Well, the researchers developed a pretty specific scoring system. It was designed to evaluate how well each census questionnaire lined up against those new, more detailed post-2015 WASH targets we talked about.
Ah, okay, like giving each census a grade?
Sort of, yeah. It was a clever way to quantify just how well each census was capturing the kind of nuanced details needed for the new SDG era. And the scoring was quite detailed. They broke it down into water components and sanitation components. For water, they called them W scores. They looked at, first, could the census distinguish improved from unimproved sources? That's W1, kind of the baseline.
Makes sense.
Then W2 was about water collection time. How long does it take people? W3 was whether the improved source was actually on the household premises. And W4 looked at coverage of water supply interruptions. Is the water reliable?
Okay, those seem like crucial practical details.
Very. And for sanitation, the S scores. S1 was about identifying open defecation. S2 was distinguishing between different basic sanitation types beyond just improved and improved. S3 assessed shared sanitation to household shared toilet. And S4 looked for information on how excreta is actually eliminated or disposed of. Is it treated safely?
Right. But hang on, you mentioned earlier that some really key things like water quality testing or maybe the existence of formal water safety plans, those weren't scored. Why not? Was it just because they weren't there?
Exactly that. They weren't scored because they were completely absent from all 2,147 analyzed census questionnaire.
Wow, all of them.
All of them. And that tells you something really stark about the current limits of census data, doesn't it? These absolutely critical elements for what we now call safely managed services, they simply aren't being captured by censuses at this point. So, okay, let's get to the findings. What did the study actually reveal? And maybe just as important, what did it hide? Well, the overall picture wasn't great, frankly. The average W score, the water score, was just 1.21. And the average S score for sanitation was 1.26. And remember, that's out of a possible maximum score of 3 for each.
Barely over 1 out of 3. That sounds low.
It is low. It really highlights a massive blind spot in our global understanding of how people actually access these essential services. It's like trying to solve a complex puzzle with only a third of the pieces.
Okay, but it wasn't all bad news, was it? Were there any positive aspects?
Yes, there were some encouraging signs. For instance, censuses are generally pretty good at that basic first step, distinguishing between improved and unimproved drinking water sources. That's W1. Only about 14% of the censuses scored 0 on that, meaning they completely missed it. Most captured that basic distinction.
Okay, that's something.
And for sanitation, identifying households practicing open defecation, the S1 score, almost 3/4 of the censuses, about 73%, captured that. So that foundational data, the very lowest level of service or lack thereof, that's actually quite encouraging for assessing inequalities among populations who have absolutely no services at all. True. But, and it's a big but, despite those positives, the study really threw a spotlight on some gaping holes in the data. Huge gaps. For water, think about this. How can you monitor if people have reliable access when a shocking 90% of censuses scored 0 in capturing water collection time?
90% miscollection time. Wow.
And even worse, supply interruptions, W4, nearly all of them, 99.6%, scored 0 on that. They just don't ask about reliability.
So we have almost no census data on whether water is consistently available.
Exactly. A fundamental piece of the puzzle, just gone. And on the sanitation side, it's just as stark. Over 83% scored 0 on distinguishing basic sanitation categories, S2. Around 58% scored 0 on capturing info about shared sanitation, S3. And over 60% scored 0 on how excreta is actually disposed of or managed, S4.
So the finer details needed for the SDGs are largely missing.
Precisely. These aren't just numbers missing from a spreadsheet. They represent missing stories of daily struggles, unreliable services, and potential health risks.
That's sobering. What about changes over time? Did the study see any improvement across the different census rounds they looked at?
Yes, that's an interesting point. Yeah. Overall, both the water and sanitation scores did show a slow but steady increase over time. This was across the 6 census rounds they grouped, stretching from 1956 right up to 2015.
So things are getting slightly better.
Slightly, yes, though it's a bit unclear how much of that improvement is directly because of international monitoring efforts pushing for better questions versus just individual countries changing their own national priorities and realizing they need this data. The study did note, for instance, a rapid increase in censuses, including categories like bottled water.
Ah, reflecting its growing importance as a source in many places.
Exactly. It shows censuses adapting, albeit slowly, to changing realities on the ground.
And was this slow improvement consistent everywhere? Or were there regional differences?
Generally, perhaps surprisingly, there weren't significant regional differences in the scores. Things were similarly, well, lacking across most regions. The one notable exception, though, was the Europe and Central Asia region ECA. That region consistently showed significantly lower scores for both water and sanitation compared to other parts of the world.
Lower. That seems counterintuitive. Any idea why?
The study didn't delve too deep into the why for that region, but it was a clear outlier in having less comprehensive WASH questions in its censuses during that period.
Okay. And beyond the things that were formally scored, did the researchers notice anything else interesting about what censuses weren't asking?
Oh, definitely. They made several other really interesting, though unscored, observations. For instance, questions specifically about hygiene, like hand-washing facilities or bathing facilities, they were only present in about a third of the censuses looked at.
Only a third. Wow.
And questions about broader sanitation issues like sewage systems or solid waste disposal, only in about a quarter.
Hmm.
Even more fundamentally, very few censuses made a distinction between someone simply having access to a facility versus whether they actually use it.
That's a huge difference functionally.
Absolutely. And almost none captured seasonal variations.
Mhm.
Does access change between wet and dry seasons? Or did they distinguish water used specifically for drinking and cooking versus other domestic uses like laundry? And here's a big one for tracking inequality within households. The WESH questions almost always appeared in the household section of the census form, not the individual section.
Meaning you can't tell if, say, women or children within a household have different access than men.
Exactly. Intra-household inequalities are basically invisible in this data. And just quickly on terminology, the JMP uses census data to define certain categories as high use, meaning they appear in over half the censuses since a certain time period. For drinking water, these are things like piped water, wells, and surface water. Pretty standard. For sanitation, it was flush or poor flush toilets, open defecation, and pit latrines. Other categories were considered low use. But it shows how terminology evolves too. For example, tube well or borehole has become much more commonly distinguished as its own category over time rather than just being lumped under well. It shows increasing specificity.
I see. So the language itself is slowly adapting. Okay, so bringing this all together, what does it mean for the future? For monitoring WASH globally? Well, it seems clear that censuses are still absolutely vital, right? Especially for that detailed monitoring, getting down to small population groups. And for tracking those higher levels of service, like safely managed water and sanitation, even if the current data is patchy.
Definitely. They remain a cornerstone.
And they can also help triangulate information, right? Like cross-reference and verify findings from surveys or administrative data.
Exactly. That cross-referencing is key for building a more robust, complete picture. No single data source tells the whole story. Looking ahead, the hope is that the finalization of the SDGs and all the work done on defining those indicators, that should provide a real push, a strong impetus for countries to harmonize their water and sanitation terminology more in future census rounds.
You'd hope so.
But we also have to be realistic. Some crucial elements, particularly things like testing water quality or tracking supply interruptions reliably. Those will likely always need more than just a census. They'll require integrating data from multiple sources, utility records, water quality surveillance, specialized surveys.
So censuses are necessary but not sufficient on their own for the full picture.
Precisely.
And one final point the study seemed to touch on was data accessibility itself, making sure this detailed data actually gets out there.
Yes, the publication of geographically disaggregated census microdata, making that anonymous individual or household level data available to researchers and policymakers, that becomes increasingly important. It's what allows for truly integrating census information with other monitoring data streams in a meaningful way.
So to wrap up, the big takeaway from this deep dive seems pretty clear. National censuses are improving slowly, and they are absolutely invaluable for understanding basic water and sanitation access around the world. We need them. But there are still these critical, widespread gaps in capturing key details, especially around safety, reliability, accessibility in practice, and sustainability.
Hmm.
And these gaps make painting that truly comprehensive picture, the one needed to track progress towards water and sanitation as a human right, really, really challenging.
It really does. And
Yeah.
perhaps that leaves us, and you listening, with a thought-provoking question to consider. Given this clear need we've discussed for more detailed, more harmonized data to properly monitor global access to water and sanitation as a human right, what innovative approaches, maybe going beyond just adding more traditional questions to a census form, could we realistically implement? How can we bridge these persistent data gaps and really make sure that no one is left behind when it comes to these essential services?
That's a really powerful question to end on. It pushes us to think creatively about data collection for fundamental human rights in a complex world. Thank you for diving deep with us today.